Absinthe is a green alcoholic beverage shrouded in myths and legends. In the late 19th century, producers employed an eccentric marketing tactic, claiming that the drink could induce hallucinations. Particular attention was drawn to the idea of the green fairy, a mysterious being that, according to legend, appears to those who drink absinthe. People told stories of how the fairy would fly by, whispering desires and promising to fulfill their deepest wishes. Of course, this was all a fabrication, a clever advertising campaign designed to stir interest in the drink and make it stand out among other alcoholic products. However, rumors spread, and soon absinthe became associated not only with inspiration and creative freedom, but also with dangerous visions, breakdowns, and even madness. People claimed that under the influence of absinthe, their minds opened to something beyond reality. Was this true? Or was it simply alcohol-induced intoxication distorting perception, turning the ordinary into something frightening? Yes, alcohol can cause many illusions. It clouds the mind, making you see and hear things that aren't really there. But believe me, what happened to me had nothing to do with ordinary drunken visions. It all started with absinthe, yes. Like many others, I wanted to experience that magical element. It happened on a Friday, at the very end of the workday. The office was filled with tense silence when the door burst open, and the boss stormed in, his face twisted with anger. He glanced around, and then his eyes locked on me. In the next moment, he yelled, "Jefferson!" I flinched. Fear paralyzed me. I had never seen him like this. There were still about 10 people left in the office, but they all, as if on cue, lowered their eyes, trying to become as small as possible to avoid being the target of his rage. But the boss was only looking at me, piercing me with his glare. Slowly, step by step, he walked toward my desk. Reluctantly, I rose from my seat, feeling every muscle in my body tense up. He stopped just inches away from me. A barrage of saliva and insults poured from his mouth. I felt the droplets hitting my face but didn't dare wipe them off. I stood there, cowering with a guilty expression, like some pathetic creature awaiting its fate. The boss roared like a bear, his voice vibrating through the office with raw hatred. I noticed his eyes had become unnaturally wide, and the veins on his forehead were pulsing, ready to burst from the strain. He was in a blind fury, and I knew exactly why. Recently, I had made a small mistake that, unfortunately, cost the company a considerable amount of money. The error seemed insignificant at first, but now it felt like the beginning of the end. He continued yelling, unloading all his pent-up anger on me, and I didn't dare say a word in my defense. Like a corporate crab, I tried to shrink as deeply as possible into my shell, hoping it would all soon be over. And just when it seemed like his voice couldn't get any louder, he suddenly went silent. The boss let out a heavy sigh, turned around and said, "On Monday, I expect to see you in my office with the HR manager. We'll be deciding your fate." He slammed the door so hard the office walls shook, and I collapsed onto my desk, exhausted. My heart was pounding wildly, and I felt as though I had just survived something unimaginably terrifying. My colleagues gave me sympathetic glances, but no one dared to approach or offer support. A heavy silence hung in the air, and I felt like I had been abandoned on a battlefield. Maybe I should just quit. I mulled over that thought repeatedly as I gathered my things. I didn't want to stay in the office until the end of the day. Too much had been said, too much now hung in the air. With my things packed, I left work, and the evening city greeted me with its cold wind, as if reminding me that the hardest trial of my life was still ahead. I wandered the streets, drained and broken. Everything that had happened in recent weeks seemed to crash down on me all at once, and each failure only made my state worse. My girlfriend had left, leaving behind only emptiness and uncertainty. At work, a complete disaster, and now the threat of being fired loomed over me. I felt lost, useless, as though life had struck me in my weakest spot. I trudged through the dark streets among passers-by rushing home or about their business. People moved with some inner purpose, almost mechanically, not noticing me or my pain. No one paid me any attention, and this loneliness amidst the crowd was even worse than being completely alone. The city around me lived its life, while I seemed to have fallen out of its rhythm, lost somewhere between reality and my thoughts. Suddenly, for no reason at all, I turned into a small alley. Why did I do that? I don't know. Maybe it was an impulse, an attempt to escape the familiar streets filled with unfamiliar faces and the bright lights of shop windows. The alley was deserted, quiet, its walls hidden in shadow, with streetlights illuminating only rare patches of the road. I walked, not thinking about anything, just moving forward, not knowing where I was going or why. And then I saw it. A small building at the far end of the alley, barely noticeable among the peeling walls and long-abandoned stores. Above the entrance hung an old, faded sign, its letters barely legible, but something about them caught my attention. The Shadow of the Phoenix. That was the name of this bar. The name was strange, mysterious, and its words seemed to resonate with my state. The phoenix, a bird that rises from the ashes. I felt like that very ash, but maybe, somewhere inside, a faint spark of hope still smoldered. I opened the door and stepped inside. It was a typical bar, like countless others in any big city. Tables were scattered haphazardly around the room, and at the far end stood a massive bar counter. In the corners, as if trying to add a touch of coziness to the place, were small potted palms. I made my way to the bar, where the bartender, a man who looked to be in his 40s, greeted me. He had a rugged look, a thick beard, a short haircut, and a face seemingly chiseled from stone. He wore a worn black leather vest over a faded gray t-shirt with the logo of some old rock band, and tattoos gleamed on his arms under the dim light. The bartender looked at me with a gaze that seemed to see right through me, as if he knew all my secrets and fears. His eyes felt too perceptive, but at that moment I didn't pay much attention. I was too beaten down and exhausted to notice anything else. All I wanted was to forget, to drink until my mind was empty and all my problems vanished, if only for one night. I sank into the high stool by the bar and began scanning for something to drink. My eyes wandered over the shelves lined with bottles of all kinds, but they suddenly stopped on one in particular. It was a green bottle, its shape elegant and alluring. The label featured a woman with seductive curves, dressed in a thin green dress that barely covered her body. Her eyes looked straight at me, beckoning, promising oblivion. The label read, "Absinthe." Without thinking, I pointed at it and ordered a shot. The bartender hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something but thought better of it. He just sighed, grabbed a glass, and opened the bottle. A thin stream of green liquid filled my glass, and without delay, I downed it in one go. It burned my throat like fire, but along with it came a strange sensation of lightness, as if all my thoughts were slowly dissolving in the hot mist. As I sat there, more patrons began to enter the bar. They filled the space with noise and chatter, breaking the strange silence that had lingered when I first walked in. Music, soft yet insistent, started playing from the speakers, and the room was soon filled with the hum of voices and laughter. It seemed like just another typical evening in just another bar. Time passed, and I kept taking shot after shot, feeling the intoxication slowly wrap around my mind. Everything around me started to blur. as if someone had pulled a foggy film over my eyes. Glancing to the side, I noticed a guy sitting nearby. He looked just as lost and empty as I was, and judging by the number of empty glasses in front of him, he was clearly drowning in his own problems. For a second, I had the thought, maybe I should go over, introduce myself, and share my sorrows. But I immediately dismissed the idea. My father always said, "Don't dump your problems on others." Those words had been ingrained in my mind since childhood, and even now, in a state of utter despair, I couldn't ignore them. I decided to leave the guy in peace. I kept drinking, but soon realized I couldn't take any more. The world around me started to spin gently, and every movement became a massive effort. I got up from the stool, barely able to keep my balance, and slowly made my way toward the exit. The bar, once noisy, began to blur before my eyes. The walls, the tables, the people, all blended into a hazy kaleidoscope. Just before reaching the door, a wave of nausea suddenly hit me. I rushed to get outside, fumbling to open the door. Once outside, I looked around, searching for a spot where no one could see me. Stumbling, I turned the corner of the bar into a narrow, dim alley. There, I immediately vomited, pressing myself against the wall, trying to collect my thoughts. The world around me continued to swim, and I couldn't focus my vision. My legs buckled, and I tripped, crashing to the ground, feeling the darkness slowly envelop me. My eyes closed, and I blacked out. When I came to, my body ached, and my head throbbed as if a bulldozer had run over it. The faint moonlight barely lit the alley, and I was still where I had fallen. The sky was dark, and when I checked my watch, I saw it was around 3 a.m. The city was asleep now, the streets empty and lifeless, with only distant sounds echoing through the blocks. Suddenly, I heard a muffled noise. It was a strange sound, like someone struggling and cursing nearby. Fear began to rise in my chest, and I, trying to stay quiet, crawled to peek around the corner, hiding in the shadows. What I saw in front of the bar was terrifying. The bar staff, led by the bearded bartender, were holding a man whose hands were bound. He was screaming and struggling desperately, begging them to let him go, claiming he had done nothing wrong. His voice echoed down the empty street, but no one except his tormentors seemed to hear him. The bartender and his assistants were dragging him back into the bar, as if they were going to do something unspeakable to him. The man's eyes were filled with terror and desperation, but those holding him looked cold and indifferent, as if this was routine for them. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I watched the scene unfold in shock and fear, unsure of how to react. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I call the police or just leave? Maybe they caught a thief or someone who didn't pay for his drink. But with every passing second, something about the situation felt more sinister. As the bar staff, along with the bartender, dragged the guy inside, I couldn't resist my curiosity. Despite my headache and the way the world was still slightly spinning, the urge to find out more won out. I decided to follow them. I quietly opened the bar door, crouched low, and sneaked inside, trying not to make any noise. The bar was empty, the lights dimmed, and only shadows from indistinct shapes flickered near the back door. I carefully made my way across the room, doing my best to avoid any sounds, and soon found myself at the counter. The silhouettes had disappeared behind a door at the end of the hallway. Something inside me screamed to stop, but curiosity prevailed. I approached the door and cautiously tugged at the handle. It opened with a quiet creak. Behind the door was a small storage room, a cramped space filled with shelves stocked with bottles, old boxes, and all the usual junk that tends to pile up in such places. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls were covered in dust. The light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered, casting strange shadows. But there was no one inside. I couldn't understand where the people could have disappeared to. I scanned the room, checking the corners and behind the shelves, but it was pointless. Then I noticed something strange on the floor. It was almost invisible, camouflaged under the old wooden boards. But when I looked closer, I could make out the faint outline of a hidden trapdoor. My heart began to race. I started searching for a way to open it and soon found a concealed handle. It was disguised as an old metal plate, barely visible in the dim light. I pulled on it, and with a loud creak, the hatch began to open. I froze, hoping that no one had heard the noise. But everything remained quiet. Slowly, I lifted the hatch and peered inside. Below, a stone staircase led down into darkness. A cold draft hit my face, as if ancient, unmoving air was rising from the depths of that stairway. I stood there, staring into the black opening, debating what could be waiting for me down there. Waves of fear washed over me, and I wanted to shut the hatch and leave, but then I remembered that guy. He had screamed. He had fought back. What if this wasn't just a bar conflict? What if they were organ traffickers or something worse? I couldn't just leave him in such a situation. Forcing myself to suppress my doubts, I steeled myself and began descending the cold stone steps. As I reached the bottom, I found myself in a stone tunnel that looked like it had been carved into the rock centuries ago. It was wide enough and tall enough for me to walk upright. On the walls hung torches, their flames flickering and casting trembling shadows on the rough stone. The scene reminded me of something out of an adventure or fantasy movie, but it didn't inspire or excite me. On the contrary, the place felt eerie, as if I had stepped into some underground world that shouldn't exist in real life. As I walked, I noticed dried blood splattered on the walls in the torchlight. It was scattered haphazardly, as if someone had been severely injured here. I forced myself not to look too closely, though the sight only added to the horror of the already terrifying situation. My head continued to pound, and occasionally, I wobbled slightly from the lingering effects of the alcohol. But despite that, I was clear-headed enough to understand that something was seriously wrong here. I continued down the tunnel until I realized that the floor was sloping downward ever so slightly. I hadn't noticed it at first, but now, as the corridor led me into an enormous cavern, it became clear that I had descended much deeper than I expected. The cave was colossal, its ceiling lost in darkness, and the walls stretched into an indistinct distance. The overwhelming sense of darkness and the vastness of the place sent chills down my spine. Ahead, I saw silhouettes. The feeling of danger surged, and I instinctively ducked behind some large boulders scattered across the cavern floor. My heart pounded in my chest and my breathing grew heavier, but I tried to calm myself as I cautiously peered out from behind my hiding spot. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. In the center of the cave stood a group of people. Among them was the bearded bartender, along with several others I had seen at the bar earlier. They were holding the man I had seen earlier, the one who had been bound. He looked terrified and exhausted, his screams and pleas seemingly falling on deaf ears now. In the middle of the cave, I saw a strange stone platform upon which lay a variety of tools and vessels resembling ancient ritual objects. The whole scene looked like something out of an occult ceremony. I crouched lower behind the rocks, trying to decide what to do next. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to flee, but I knew that leaving now would mean abandoning that guy to certain doom. What were they planning to do to him? And what was this place anyway? The thought crossed my mind that I could try to call the police. But my phone seemed useless here, deep in these underground caverns. The only option left was to figure out what was happening and, if possible, try to help the poor man. I kept watching, afraid to move any closer, trying to understand what was going on. The waitress slowly laid out candles on the floor, carefully following a pattern that had been drawn there earlier. It seemed that each candle had its own purpose and exact place. When she finished, two others, a man and a woman, joined her, lighting the candles one by one, passing the flame from one to another. Everything was done with a terrifying synchronicity, as if they had performed this ritual many times before. The bartender, still gripping the bound man, stood motionless, waiting. Once the candles were lit, they all formed a circle, and I thought they were going to place the man in the center to complete the ritual. But to my surprise, they didn't put him in the center. Instead, he became part of the pattern, one of its components. The man who had been struggling and shouting earlier now stood perfectly still, as if hypnotized. His eyes were empty. He didn't move, and it seemed like he wasn't even aware of what was happening around him. They began to whisper. Their voices were low and barely audible, sounding more like a prayer than a conversation. The prayer went on for what felt like an eternity as I continued hiding behind the boulders, trying to grasp what was happening. The eerie silence of the cave, mixed with their whispers, pressed down on my ears. The man bound within the pattern stood as still as a statue, never attempting to flee, as if his will had completely vanished. Suddenly I noticed something strange. The air around the circle where the people stood began to ripple, as if some sort of energy was forming. It was barely visible, but its presence could be felt physically. Then the horrifying things began to happen. The first thing I saw was the male waiter who had lit the candles start to tremble. His body convulsed as if he were being shaken by a cold, terrifying force. He clutched at his chest, and then his eyes rolled back, his pupils spinning wildly. The waitresses standing beside him began to twitch just as violently. Their heads jerked backward, their mouths open in silent screams, and their bodies contorted in agonizing spasms. And then the nightmare truly began. One of the women started to transform before my very eyes. Her skin became covered in feathers, her face elongated into a long beak, and her eyes narrowed into slits, like those of a predatory bird. She was no longer human. Standing before me was a monster with the body of a woman and the head of a chicken. Her arms barely retained their human shape, but her nails had turned into sharp talons. Beside her, the other woman morphed into something even more grotesque. Her skin became scaly, her legs bent at an unnatural angle, and she began to resemble a lizard. Her eyes turned vertical, glowing with a malicious glint in the candlelight. She still wore her uniform, which now strained against her bulging muscles and transformed body, as if the clothes no longer fit the creature she had become. The male waiter, meanwhile, transformed into a cat-like creature. But it wasn't just a simple cat. His body elongated. His movements became predatory and smooth. He resembled something like an anthropomorphic monster, a human body forced into feline shapes. His claws were long, and his face merged with the features of a beast, though he still wore his work uniform, which now hung loosely on his stretched limbs. And then there was a deafening roar. The bartender, who had stood motionless until now, suddenly began to change. His arms broadened, muscles bulging beneath his skin, and from his back came a deep, guttural growl. His face started to elongate, his nose becoming a snout, and his teeth grew sharper, like those of a predator. His eyes glowed bright yellow, and before me stood a wolf. massive, powerful, with a muscular body. He was still wearing his same leather vest and t-shirt, which now tore under the pressure of his changing form. His legs, now covered in thick fur, were bent into a feral stance, and his clawed hands grasped the air hungrily. The roar echoed through the entire cave, and I felt myself teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was I still drunk? Could this be a dream? But no, I was witnessing it with my own eyes, and the reality around me no longer obeyed any rules I understood. Everything unfolding before me defied human comprehension, and with every passing second it grew more terrifying. My legs felt like jelly, and the horror building in my chest made me want to run as far away as possible. But I couldn't. I looked at the bound man, still standing there, hypnotized. Damn it, my parents had raised me to be too kind and responsible. I couldn't abandon that poor guy, even if it meant putting myself in even greater danger. I continued to watch, trying not to reveal my presence. And then something unexpected happened. In the center of the circle, around which the creature stood, there was a low rumble as a massive stone door began to rise from the ground. The sound was so deafening that it felt as if the earth itself was parting before this unholy mechanism. When the door fully emerged from the ground, the monsters, led by the wolf-like bartender, gathered around it, still clutching the bound man. The bartender approached the stone door and with a growl pushed it open. The door creaked so loudly that chills ran down my spine, as though the sound came from a realm not of this world, but from some foreign, malevolent universe. When the stone door opened, I was paralyzed with shock. On the other side of the doorway, there wasn't just another section of the cave as I had expected. Instead, a dark, foreboding forest stretched out before them. The trees were blacker than the night, their branches twisted into strange, sinister shapes. An icy wind blew from that forest, as if it existed in a place where neither time nor light had ever existed. The monsters, dragging the man, disappeared into this forest, and within moments, the door closed behind them, leaving me in complete silence once again. I sat in my hiding place, trying to process everything that had happened. My head throbbed, my heart pounded wildly, but I knew that I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I approached the spot where the door had been and examined the stone frame left behind. On the ground was an intricate design, carved into the stone, resembling satanic symbols. These patterns filled me with a deep sense of unease, their lines radiating malevolence, reminiscent of ancient rituals and curses. I got closer and carefully inspected the door. It still stood in place, appearing massive and immovable, but I was determined to try to open it. I braced myself and pushed against the door, but it barely budged. I pressed my shoulder into it and summoned all my strength, trying to pry it open even just a little. After several grueling seconds of creaking and strain, I managed to create a small gap. From the other side, that same icy wind from the otherworldly forest blew through, sending a chill deep into my bones. As I pushed the door with all my might, the stone creaked open just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I hurried inside, wanting to escape the strange events behind me, only to find myself in what felt like another world. I stood in a forest, seemingly ordinary at first glance, but something was horribly wrong. The first thing that struck me was the absolute silence. There wasn't a whisper of wind, no bird song, no rustling of leaves, just a suffocating, unnatural stillness. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood up immediately. My mind raced to find an explanation, but there was none. This silence wasn't normal. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to happen. I scanned my surroundings, trying to pinpoint the source of this overwhelming fear. The forest was dark, though the moon and stars shone dimly through the dense canopy, casting a faint glow that my eyes quickly adjusted to. Slowly and cautiously, I began to move forward, trying to be as quiet as possible, though every step on the dry leaves beneath my feet sounded deafening in the eerie silence. I was desperate to figure out where those monsters had gone after disappearing behind the door, and soon I noticed a narrow path leading deeper into the woods. I walked slowly, my eyes constantly darting back to check if anything was following me. Nothing moved around me. Except for me, the forest felt dead, as if every living thing had abandoned it long ago. The only sound was the crackling of leaves underfoot, echoing unnervingly in the emptiness. Every crackle and rustle made me stop in my tracks, cold sweat running down my back. But the threat remained unseen. As I moved further along, the path began to widen, and the underbrush gradually thinned, giving way to towering columns of massive trees. The moonlight illuminated these enormous trunks, and I finally began to see more of the forest's disturbing details. Webs, giant spider webs, were strung between the trees. I instinctively jerked my arms and legs, imagining the sticky threads brushing against me. These webs were enormous, far larger than any I had ever seen. The strands were as thick as ropes, meaning the spider that wove them must have been monstrous. A shiver ran down my spine. Spiders had always been my deepest fear, and now I was standing in the middle of their domain, where every step could lead to an encounter with one of these creatures. I continued forward, my heart beating faster, when suddenly, between the branches, I saw something even more terrifying. Hanging from the trees were enormous cocoons, bundles wrapped tightly in webbing. These cocoons were human-sized, and they hung like fruits from the branches. For a moment I thought I saw something move inside one of them. Panic flooded my body. Fear paralyzed me for a brief second, but my survival instincts kicked in, and I felt myself start to move. Adrenaline surged through me, and I began to rush forward, quickening my pace. My legs fumbled through the leaves and roots, but I couldn't stop. The sensation that something massive and malevolent was watching me grew stronger. Every second spent here felt like an eternity. I kept running, panic coursing through my veins, when suddenly I tripped and fell face first to the ground. The soft, leaf-covered earth cushioned my fall, but it did little to calm my nerves. As I scrambled to get back on my feet, my hands shaking, I heard a creaking sound above me. It was like the groan of a rope being pulled taut, and the sound sent shivers down my spine. Slowly, I lifted my head, and what I saw froze me in place. Descending toward me was something enormous and horrifying. It resembled a spider in form, but only in its structure. Its 8 legs were covered in something that looked like tree bark, as if the creature had been made of wood. Its body appeared artificially constructed, as though someone had carved it out of rough timber. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. Attached to where the spider's head should have been was a human torso, grotesquely small for the creature's massive size. Its arms were crooked and bent like those of an old man, moving unnaturally fast and at sharp angles. But instead of a human head on the torso, there was the head of a monkey, deformed and twisted into a horrifying, almost mechanical grin, as if the smile had been permanently carved into its face. It was a monstrous chimera, stitched together from various beings and materials, foreign to this world and to my understanding. The creature continued to descend on its thin web or cord, creaking with every movement. I stood frozen, a wave of terror washing over my entire body. My heart pounded so fast, I thought it might explode. I felt utterly helpless. Panic overwhelmed me, and I couldn't move. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. Fear rooted me to the spot, even holding my breath as if the slightest movement might provoke an attack. The creature lowered itself even closer, hovering just above me, and its head turned down to stare. Its eyes, those of the twisted monkey, glowed with a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. It was as if the creature was as afraid of me as I was of it. But that paled in comparison to the overwhelming terror that gripped me. The creature spoke, its voice unexpectedly clear and human-like. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed hard, feeling my throat dry up. Fear gripped my chest, and I knew that everything depended on my response. The creature's head loomed close, its lifeless eyes studying me as if weighing my fate. I forced myself to speak, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Just walking," I said, but my voice betrayed me, trembling with fear. The creature furrowed its brow, as if contemplating my answer. Then it began to circle around me, moving as if guided by an unseen rope. It encircled me, inspecting from all angles as though trying to understand what I was. My skin crawled and fear gripped me again. It stopped in front of me once more and spoke. "So, you're just walking. I see. What's your name?" I held my breath, thinking about what to say. It felt like any wrong word could seal my doom. The creature was wary, but I sensed it feared me as much as I feared it. I decided to take a risk. "That's none of your business," I said, trying to sound as firm as possible, though I was anything but. "I'm lost. Will you show me the way out?" My voice was steady, though inside I was trembling like a leaf. My heart pounded, but I tried not to show my weakness. The creature seemed to tense. Its pupils narrowed, and it froze for a moment. It looked like my sudden change in tone had startled it. "Forgive me. I didn't recognize you right away," it muttered, retreating a little. "Of course, I will show you the way." With those words, it bit through the cord it had been hanging from and landed heavily on the ground with a dull thud. It moved slowly, crawling, each of its legs creaking as if they were made of old wood. The creature was grotesque, and every step it took filled me with disgust and fear. But I had no choice. I had to follow it. I took a step forward, and with each step, the overwhelming terror began to give way to the necessity of moving forward. As we walked, the creature kept glancing back at me, as if sniffing the air, its expression shifting between nervous and suspicious. Cold sweat trickled down my spine, and I tried to keep my fear in check. With every passing second, I felt like it would discover my lie, or sense my weakness, and that would be the end of me. The creature continued its slow progress, its wooden legs creaking like old doors on rusty hinges. Every now and then, it muttered something quietly, but I caught one phrase clearly. "Soon I'll feast. Soon my meal will ripen. But it's just rabbits. I'm so tired of rabbits." My legs faltered at those words. My heart raced. What did it mean by rabbits? And how soon would it decide that I was suitable for its meal? As these questions swirled in my mind, the creature suddenly stopped, tensing and listening intently. It sniffed the air, and without warning it leaped into the bushes, vanishing from sight. I was left standing there, unsure of what to do. My heart pounded wildly, fear taking over my entire body. In the eerie silence of the forest, all I could hear was my own labored breathing. Seconds passed, and the creature didn't return. This was my chance. I couldn't wait for it to come back. Summoning all the courage I had, I quickened my pace and followed the same path it had been leading me on. My footsteps seemed deafening in the dead silence of the forest, but I tried not to think about the fact that the creature could return at any moment. As I sped up, I suddenly heard the familiar creak, the sound of a cord rubbing against a tree. I stopped dead in my tracks, and once again the monstrous creature appeared right in front of me. It leaped onto the path, holding something strange in its hands. My heart stopped in terror as I realized what it was. A rabbit. But instead of a regular rabbit's face, it had the face of a human infant. The creature's eyes were closed and its body was limp, but the spider-monkey hybrid licked its lips, eyeing its prey like a starving beast. "Excuse me," it rasped in its chilling voice. "Could you wait a moment? I just need to hide this, and then we can continue." I froze in place, paralyzed. My body refused to move or respond. I just stood there, staring, unable to speak. The creature seemed to take my silence as agreement and immediately began spinning its web. It quickly wrapped the rabbit baby hybrid in thick strands of webbing, and with each pass of the web, I felt my stomach turn. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. Then the most horrifying thing happened. As the creature was halfway through wrapping the rabbit, it suddenly came to life. A scream burst from its throat, but it wasn't the scream of an animal. It was the scream of a human baby filled with pain and fear. The sound cut through my nerves like a blade, and I felt like I was losing my mind. One thought pounded in my head. I had never been this terrified in my life. The creature, seemingly alarmed by the rabbit's sudden revival, sped up, quickly wrapping it entirely in webbing, silencing its cries. All I could do was watch as the spider finished its grotesque work, tying the cocooned rabbit to a branch overhead. Those same types of cocoons I had seen earlier hanging in the trees, and now I realized they might have all been alive. The realization made me sick to my core. The creature jumped down from the tree and stood before me as if nothing had happened. "You may follow me," it said, resuming its path along the trail. I didn't know what to do, but my legs moved on their own, automatically following it. My mind was still reeling from everything I had just witnessed. Every time the creature spoke, I couldn't help but listen closely, and with each word, I grew more terrified. "These rabbits bore me," it muttered, licking its lips. "How I long for something else, to taste human flesh." But where could I find a human? Each time it said these words, it would turn its grotesque monkey head toward me, drooling with hunger. The sight made my skin crawl, and I struggled to keep myself from bolting. Yet in its eyes there was still a flicker of fear. It was afraid of me, though it didn't know who I was. We continued walking, but with each step, I became more certain that our journey would end badly if this creature decided I wasn't as threatening as I pretended to be. The forest slowly began to thin, and I realized we were nearing the edge. A small spark of hope ignited in me that this nightmare might soon be over. Finally, we stepped out from the shadows of the trees, and before me stretched an open field, bathed in the faint light of the moon. In the distance, a large river wound its way around the base of the hills, its quiet current seeming like the only safe thing in this cursed world. The creature walking ahead stopped and turned its horrifying head toward me. "Here, I brought you out. What will be my reward?" it said, expecting an answer. My heart clenched with fear. Reward? I had to give it something. Panic surged through my mind as I frantically considered what I could offer. I had two things: my phone and my wallet. I quickly glanced at my pockets, but I knew no amount of money would satisfy this creature. It wanted something far more significant. I have nothing," I said hoarsely, feeling the adrenaline surge through my veins again. Its eyes narrowed and its face began to change. What was once surprise now twisted into pure malice. It slowly leaned toward me, sniffing the air, turning its monkey head from side to side. I could feel its gaze sharpen, as though it had suddenly realized something important. Its eyes widened, and from its throat came a shriek, "You're human!" At that moment, I knew my time was up. It had figured me out. The creature crouched, tensing, and then sprang toward me with terrifying speed. But my panic and survival instincts kicked in faster. I managed to leap to the side just in time, the monster missing me by inches. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might explode. I scrambled to my feet without thinking. The river was ahead of me, my only hope of escape. I sprinted toward the water, not daring to look back, feeling every joint in my body scream with fear and exhaustion. Behind me, I could hear that familiar creaking sound, the terrifying sound of the creature's wooden legs as it quickly closed the distance. Every step it took echoed in my mind like the sound of approaching death. My legs seemed to move on their own, carrying me forward. My blood pounded in my temples, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The river was so close now, its calm waters calling to me with the promise of safety. I could hear the creature gaining speed, its presence looming closer with every second. The creaking grew louder, and I knew that at any moment its claws would sink into my back. At last I reached the riverbank. Without a second thought, I jumped into the water, feeling the cold current instantly engulf me. The water splashed against my face, and the sound of creaking legs was replaced by a frantic scream. "No! You're mine!" The creature shrieked behind me, but I was already submerged, fighting against the cold and the fast-moving current. I heard it pacing on the shore, howling in frustration as it realized it had lost its prey. But I kept swimming, letting the river carry me further away from this nightmare. At first, I felt nothing but relief as the current swept me along. I had escaped. But soon, I began to notice something strange. The first thing that struck me was a sharp, metallic smell. It hit my nose with such force that I instantly recognized it. The smell of blood. The water I was swimming in was red, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight, I realized the horrifying truth. The river was made of blood. The revelation nearly made me vomit. My stomach tightened and my head spun. I tried to swim toward the shore, but every stroke felt more desperate. The water was thick and sticky, and the metallic taste clung to my lips, filling me with disgust. My heart raced as I frantically paddled, when suddenly I heard a splashing noise nearby. I turned around and saw something horrifying. Creatures resembling octopuses, but with more grotesque bodies, were coming toward me. Their movements were unnatural, almost as if they weren't swimming, but slowly sinking and then rising again. Their bodies writhed, and it seemed as though they were consuming the space between us. These creatures appeared to have come straight out of a nightmare, and their rapid approach filled me with primal fear. "Damn it!" raced through my mind. In a panic, I began paddling faster, desperately trying to reach the shore before the creatures caught up to me. My hand felt the thick grass on the bank, and I gripped it so hard that my fingers went numb. With a powerful pull, I dragged my body onto the land, feeling my legs struggle to escape the sticky, dense water. The creatures were almost upon me, their disgusting tentacles nearly touching me. But then they suddenly froze and submerged back into the water, disappearing from sight. I lay still for a moment, lying on the ground, unable to tear my eyes away from the spot where the creatures had just been. Fear raged inside me, but at the same time I felt a strange sense of relief. But that relief didn't last long. I knew those creatures could return at any moment. Everything here felt alien, hostile. It was as if reality itself was trying to destroy me. I glanced around and saw nothing but tall grass stretching out in all directions. There was no one near the river. I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Red water dripped off my body, soaking into the grass. I lay there, staring up at the sky, trying to process everything that had just occurred. Last night, I had been an ordinary person, drinking and relaxing. Now, I found myself in a world of nightmares, where every moment was filled with horror. I was drained, emptied, as if I were being turned inside out. After some time, when my strength had somewhat returned, I forced myself to stand. My legs were still trembling and my arms felt weak. I peeled off my clothes, soaked in the river's blood, and tried to wring them out. It was disgusting. Cold, sticky liquid oozed from the fabric, but I had no other choice. Putting my clothes back on made me feel slightly better, though a deep sense of unease lingered within me. I began to look around, trying to figure out what to do next. Thoughts of rescuing that guy who had been taken by the monsters had long since vanished from my mind. Now, I had to think only of myself. I considered how to get out of here and realized one thing. Going back into the forest would be suicide. That creature was waiting for me, and I was certain it wouldn't stop trying to devour me. The only option left was to find another way. I walked through the tall grass and soon came upon a trail. It was the same trail I had followed into the forest. On the ground, I saw tracks, boot prints alongside massive paw prints. My mind immediately understood. These were the tracks of the same creatures I had seen earlier. My stomach turned, but I knew this was my only chance. This is fate, I thought, and decided to follow those tracks despite the terror that gripped me. I walked along the trail, which soon led me to a wide dirt road. I could see wheel tracks on the road, as if carts or something similar had recently passed through. The tracks stretched far into the distance, and I decided to follow them, all the while glancing forward and backward, afraid of being spotted by anyone or anything that might inhabit this place. The road led me through fields of tall grass, occasionally bordered by sparse, dried-up trees, as if nature itself had abandoned this place. After a while, the outlines of houses began to emerge ahead. It was a village. My breath caught, and I instantly felt a wave of anxiety. Ordinary people couldn't live here. This place was far too strange. Without hesitation, I left the road and continued on, hiding in the bushes, trying to avoid being seen. I walked along the road, concealed by the tall bushes, until I reached a wooden fence surrounding the village. It looked worn and in disrepair, but it was still sturdy enough to keep whatever was inside contained. I carefully looked around and saw no one. No movement, no sounds. Not even birds seemed to fly near this place. Then I decided to sneak closer to the gate, moving as quietly as possible. When I reached the gate, I slowly opened it, producing only a faint creak, and peeked inside. What lay before me was a strange, eerie village. The first thing I noticed was that the houses had no windows. They looked gloomy and shut off, as if they weren't meant for living. Every house was crooked and old, as if no one had lived in them for years. All the doors were tightly closed, and some even had heavy locks or chains on them, as if the owners were afraid something might break in. But there wasn't a single person on the streets. Absolute emptiness. Only the wind blowing between the houses, kicking up dust and rustling dry leaves. In the center of the village stood a well, old, made of stone, with a moss-covered roof. The well was the only object that seemed relatively well kept. but there were no signs of life around it. This place breathed abandonment, yet something about its atmosphere was unsettling. It felt as if the village was waiting for something, or perhaps hiding something within its walls. A chill ran down my spine, but despite the fear, I decided to step inside. Slowly, I walked through the gates, feeling the tension rise with each step. It was far too quiet, the kind of silence that only exists in places where eerie things are just beginning to awaken. I decided to take a closer look and headed toward the well, trying to stay alert. As I walked past the houses, the silence was suddenly broken by an unexpected noise coming from one of the buildings. Fear shot through me and I froze, glancing around. The noise continued. It was coming from inside the house, and it sounded like someone was pounding on the walls, desperately trying to escape. There were also creaks and groans, like muffled cries. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there as fast as I could, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved closer to the house, listening intently. The banging sound persisted, intensifying my anxiety. My eyes fixed on the door. Unlike the other houses where heavy locks hung on the doors, this one had nothing on it, as if it were simply shut. My curiosity grew. What could it be? But my mind warned me that if I opened this door, something terrifying might lunge at me. Maybe there were people inside, in need of help. Pushing my fear aside, I approached the door and pulled the handle. To my surprise, it wasn't locked, but as soon as I began to open it, I felt resistance from the other side. Someone, or something, was preventing me from opening the door. The pulling grew stronger, as if the creature behind the door was getting anxious, sensing my approach. I tensed, and suddenly, a hand reached through the narrow opening of the door. It wasn't a human hand. The skin was green, covered in some kind of slime, torn and rotting in places. All I could think was, it's a zombie or something like that. Something no longer alive. Panic overwhelmed me, and I quickly let go of the handle. The door slammed shut, pinching the hand, and an enraged scream rang out like something straight from hell. I nearly screamed myself, feeling horror fill every inch of me. I was ready to run, but the door remained closed, and no more sounds came from behind it. My heart raced, and I cursed myself for my stupidity and inappropriate curiosity. Backing away from the door, I headed toward the center of the village, passing by the old well. As I walked past, I noticed something strange inside. I approached and looked down, freezing in place. Inside the well there was fire. It didn't just glow. It beckoned to me, as if casting a spell to draw me closer. I couldn't tear my eyes away, as if my mind was being drawn into this strange dance of flames. The fire was hypnotic, and with each passing second I felt something pulling me down. Before I realized it, I had leaned over the well so far that half my body was hanging over the edge. It was as if someone was holding me at the brink of the abyss, forcing me to sink deeper. Suddenly, something inside me jolted, like an electric shock to my nerves, and I snapped out of it. I jerked back, as if I had leaped from a trap. My head was buzzing, my heart pounding. I realized I had been on the verge of falling into the well. What the hell was that? I didn't waste another second thinking, and gathering the last of my strength, made my way toward the village exit. On the other side, I saw another set of gates, just as decrepit and heavy as the first. Without hesitation, I opened them and quickly left this eerie place, feeling the air behind me grow more oppressive with each step. I kept walking along the road, staring at the ground, trying not to miss a single footprint. My steps were cautious, and I carefully studied the path ahead. The tracks I was following reassured me that I was on the right path, which calmed me slightly. After a couple of miles, the road ahead began to split, forcing me to stop. I looked around, trying to find some trace or sign that would point me in the right direction, but there was nothing. No tracks, no markings that could help me choose. I could only hope for luck. After a brief hesitation, I chose the left path and moved forward. I walked quietly, constantly glancing over my shoulder, feeling the tension creeping back. Up ahead, a large mountain loomed, and in the distance, I noticed some movement. My heart stopped. Something was happening ahead, and my instincts told me to proceed with caution. Suddenly, a loud noise erupted behind me. I froze, my heart racing. Quickly leaping off the road, I hid in the bushes, trying to remain still and quiet. Through the branches, I saw a cart roll down the road, pulled by a grotesque creature. It wasn't a normal horse or donkey, it was something else entirely. The creature was hideous, its body a hybrid between a horse and a donkey, but with mutated limbs covered in fur like a wild beast. Its eyes glowed yellow, and its teeth were sharp and exposed, as if it was eager to tear into its prey. I crouched in the bushes, hiding and breathing as quietly as I could, until the cart passed by me. The driver, if you could call it that, looked just as disturbing as the creature pulling it. It had long limbs and a face hidden beneath a hood, but even from a distance, I could sense that this being was not of this world. Once the cart had disappeared into the distance, I emerged from the bushes but didn't dare return to the road. Instead, I continued walking alongside it, staying hidden in the underbrush, until I spotted a massive structure up ahead. I approached and realized it was a quarry. From afar, I could hear the sound of stone being struck, metal scraping, and strange cries. I crouched low, trying not to draw attention, and crept closer until I found a tree that allowed me to observe everything happening below. I cautiously climbed up the tree and hid in its thick branches. What I saw made me freeze in horror. At the quarry below, creatures that at first glance resembled people were working. But as I looked closer, I realized they were chimeras, half human, half beast. Some had chicken legs, others had rabbit heads, and some were covered in fur like animals, yet they walked on two legs. All of them were digging at the rocks, hammering the earth, trying to avoid attracting the attention of the overseers. The overseers were even more terrifying. Massive, anthropomorphic creatures that resembled dogs but had human features. They wore leather clothing and held long whips, which they mercilessly cracked over the workers, forcing them to work faster. These creatures were enormous, with sharp teeth and menacing eyes. They didn't speak, only growled and made strange noises as they gave orders. Chills ran down my spine. It was like a surreal nightmare. These creatures didn't belong to any world I could comprehend. I was about to climb down from the tree when I saw one of the creatures with a rabbit head strike a green stone, producing a loud noise. The stone screamed. It wasn't a normal scream, but a wail of pain and anger. The creature with the rabbit head paid no attention and tossed the screaming stone into a basket. The stone continued to scream, cursing and demanding to be handled with care. But its words were drowned out by the noise of the quarry. I couldn't take it anymore. A deep, primal fear gripped my body. I climbed down from the tree as quietly as I could and hurried back to the fork in the road. This time I chose the other path, hoping it would lead me far away from these horrific places. I continued walking down the road, feeling exhaustion slowly building in my legs. Everything I had experienced so far, the chase, sneaking around, the horrifying creatures, had taken its toll. My mind and body craved rest. Soon, I noticed a small grove surrounded by bushes that looked secluded enough. I veered off the road and hid in the shade of the trees, sinking to the ground to rest for a while. The wind gently swayed the tree branches, and for a brief moment, I even thought that this place seemed safer than what I had seen before. I tried to relax, but suddenly I heard light footsteps on the road. Hiding behind the bushes, I carefully peeked out. Strange creatures were running down the road, something like anthropomorphic figures, but their movements were jerky and unnatural, as if their bodies moved in ragged, stuttering bursts. I couldn't make out their faces as they dashed past, but these beings clearly didn't belong to the ordinary world. Once they disappeared into the distance, I finally stood up and continued on my way. I walked further along the road, keeping my guard up, always listening for any sounds around me. Soon I saw a large mansion ahead. Its silhouette loomed against the starry sky, and even from afar it looked dark and ominous. As I got closer, I began to inspect it with caution. The mansion was old and decrepit, though it still bore traces of its former grandeur. Massive stone walls rose upward as if reaching for the sky. The windows were covered in dust and shut with heavy shutters. The grass in the yard was tall and overgrown, and the wrought iron gates in front of the house appeared rusty and almost abandoned. Yet despite its neglect, something about this place made me wary. I approached the gates and slowly opened them, trying not to make a sound. Inside the courtyard on the old grounds, something strange and unsettling caught my eye. In the center stood a large cage, and inside it was a man. I looked closely and realized that it was the very man I had tried to save earlier. He sat inside the cage, exhausted and with his head hung low, as if he had lost all hope. In front of the cage were rows of chairs, neatly arranged as if in preparation for some kind of event. The chairs were lined up in several rows on one side, as though for an audience. On the opposite side stood a platform with 3 large chairs that looked like judges' seats. The atmosphere was strange and tense, as if this place was intended for some kind of ritual or trial. But what was even stranger? Aside from the man in the cage, there was no one else in the courtyard. I slowly examined the scene, feeling the tension and fear begin to mount. Everything seemed poised for something sinister to happen, but for now, I was the only witness to this eerie spectacle. Realizing there was no immediate danger, I crouched down and ran toward the cage where the man was sitting. I began frantically examining it, looking for a way to open the lock. The man inside stirred and looked at me with surprise, as if he hadn't expected to see anyone here. Seeing this, I said, "Hang on, I'll get you out of here soon." But the man didn't look as relieved as I had expected. He was startled, almost as if he saw someone who wasn't supposed to be here. I kept searching for the lock, but quickly realized that the cage was sealed with a key, and without it, there was no way I could open it. My heart pounded harder. I couldn't leave him like this. The man finally spoke, his voice tense. "Who are you?" "I'm here to save you," I replied, not stopping my efforts to find any way to open the cage. "Do you know what this place is? Where are we?" The man furrowed his brow, as if he was pondering something crucial. He didn't answer right away, but after a brief pause, he asked another question. "Are you human?" I froze, not understanding why he was so interested in that, but I answered anyway. "Of course human, just like you." The man let out a heavy sigh and looked at me with sadness. "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly he started screaming. His voice cut through the silence so sharply that I instinctively flinched. I tried to calm him down, not understanding why he was acting this way. I was just trying to help. But his screams grew louder and louder, and I realized I had no choice but to hide. The situation was becoming too dangerous. I quickly darted into the nearest bushes and remained motionless, blending into the shadows. Moments later, creatures like those overseeing the quarry rushed to the cage. They surrounded it and began questioning the man. "What's happening?" The man inside the cage screamed even louder. "There's a human here." The creatures, however, merely sneered, not believing his words. They opened the cage and began beating him with their long, clawed hands. One of them said with disdain, "Idiot. Don't try to save yourself. You're already condemned." They beat him for several more minutes before stepping out of the cage and standing nearby. Soon other creatures began gathering in the courtyard, taking seats on the chairs as if they were attending some important event. I crouched in the bushes, watching with horrifying clarity that this was no ordinary trial. This was something ancient and terrifying, something beyond my understanding. The bartender I had seen earlier emerged onto the platform. He took a seat in one of the 3 large chairs, clearly feeling like an important figure in this place. However, the central chair remained empty. I continued watching, frozen in place, as suddenly something else appeared on the platform. It was a being that seemed more shadow than body. It moved so smoothly it appeared to glide above the ground. Completely concealed beneath a black robe, it radiated a cold terror. Only its glowing eyes were visible beneath the hood, like windows into a void. The creature took the central chair, and its voice, cold and penetrating, echoed through the courtyard. "Laris, you broke our rules. You killed a human from the other side." Upon hearing this name, I realized the prisoner's name was Laris. The creature continued, "This happened during a time when killings were forbidden. As you all know, we have a pact with the humans that allows us to hunt only at certain times. Those who break this pact face death." The burning eyes of the creature focused on Laris, and I felt an icy chill run through me. It went on, "How dare you remain in this form? Reveal your true self." The man in the cage began to shake, his face contorted, and suddenly I realized my mistake. All this time, I had thought I was saving a human. But before my eyes, Laris began to transform. His body writhed and twisted, and before me emerged a monster, a rat, or rather a creature with a human body and a rat's face. A long tail slithered out of his clothes, and sharp claws appeared on his hands. Laris, who had seemed human in my eyes, was a chimera. I watched this transformation, feeling both anger and fear swell inside me. I had risked my life to save a monster. Now I understood that this creature deserved its fate. Laris fell to his knees, pleading pitifully with the creature in the robe. "Spare me. Please don't kill me." The being, like an embodiment of death itself, remained unmoved. Its voice was cold and merciless, as though it were delivering a final judgment. "Your time is up." I stayed hidden, cursing myself for being fooled by this deception. Suddenly the rat began looking around and said, "There's a human here. I know there's a human here." I froze. Its voice sounded hysterical, as though it was trying to delay its execution, to distract those who had come to judge it. The hooded being sitting on the throne chuckled darkly and said, "What nonsense are you spouting? Don't make things up. How could a human possibly be here?" But the rat continued to insist, trembling in fear and desperately trying to buy itself time. Suddenly, a creature resembling a giant hound, which had been silent until now, lifted its nose and sniffed the air. Its eyes flared, and it bared its teeth. "I do smell a human." I froze, feeling my heart clench with fear. The dog-like creature snapped its head in my direction and pointed with its paw. "He's hiding there." The world seemed to stand still for a moment. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I knew I had been found. There was only one option left: to run. I bolted from the bushes without looking back, sprinting as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, I heard the monstrous roar of the creatures as they gave chase. Their heavy footsteps thundered on the ground, getting closer with each passing second. Their breathing grew louder, almost at my back. Every moment felt like an eternity. I dashed out of the estate, leaping over rocks and branches, hearing the monsters close in. Desperately, I searched for a way out and soon crashed into the forest, hoping against hope that the trees and shadows would be my salvation. The forest felt endless, and I raced through its dense darkness, branches clawing at my skin. But I couldn't stop. My chest burned with heavy breaths. My heart pounded so loudly that I thought the monsters could hear it. The pursuit didn't let up. The creatures tore through the earth behind me, their snarls echoing through the air like a malevolent chorus. I knew they were surrounding me. The sound of their steps came from all directions, as if they were closing in on me like a tightening net. With every step, their chase became more relentless, and my strength was fading. Panic overwhelmed me, and the only thought screaming in my mind was, "This is the end. This is my end." The realization hit me hard. I wouldn't escape. They would catch me. The world around me closed in, turning the forest into a trap. I could almost feel their hot breath on my back, their claws ready to sink into my flesh. In that moment of utter desperation, the ground beneath my feet suddenly gave way. For one horrifying second, I lost control of my body and realized I was falling into some kind of deep pit. The air constricted around me, and the scream that wanted to escape my throat remained silent. Everything happened too quickly. I blacked out before I could even comprehend what had occurred. I woke up on a cold concrete floor, assaulted by an awful stench that filled my nostrils. Opening my eyes, I saw a puddle of vomit nearby. Disgusted, I quickly got up, my head spinning. Looking around, I was horrified to realize where I was, behind the bar, in the exact spot where I had thrown up the night before. I had passed out there, but now that I was awake, it was morning. I stood there, confused, trying to make sense of it all. Where were the monsters I had seen last night? How did I end up here? At first glance, it seemed like nothing had happened, but my head throbbed, and deep down, I knew that everything I had experienced wasn't just a product of my imagination. I checked myself. My clothes were fine, no blood, no wounds. It was as if the horrors I had endured were merely a dream. But I knew it couldn't have been just a dream. Outside, people walked by, glancing at me with disgust, likely mistaking me for a drunk who had spent the night behind the bar. But I didn't care. Their opinions meant nothing to me. I staggered forward, leaving the alley. When I looked up, I saw the place where I thought the bar had been last night. But instead of the familiar building with its sign, there was an abandoned, boarded-up house. No sign, no trace of the bar ever existing. It had simply vanished. I stared at it in confusion. What is this? I thought. Had it all been a dream? I walked up to the boarded-up door and tried to pull it, but it was tightly sealed. The windows were boarded up too, and everything about the house suggested it had been vacant for years. People walked past, ignoring me, while I stood there, trying to understand what this all meant. Had it all really happened? Or had it been just a dream? I couldn't believe it. Everything had been so real. The terror, the monsters, the shape-shifting bartender, the trial. Inside me, chaos was brewing. On one hand, I was relieved to have escaped alive, but on the other I couldn't grasp whether it had been reality or a nightmare. Everything that had happened felt too real. I looked around again, trying to find some clue, But all I saw was an ordinary street, ordinary people, and this abandoned house. I inwardly sighed with relief, thankful that I had made it out alive. But the doubts gnawed at me. Those creatures, those events, they couldn't have just been a figment of my mind. I went home, trying to make sense of it all. Several times after that night, I returned to the place, hoping to find some trace of the bar or the creatures. But every time, it was just the same boarded-up house. Those I told about it just laughed and said I must have dreamed it or had hallucinations. But I knew what I had seen was real. My memories were too vivid, too sharp. Since then, I hadn't seen those creatures again. But the words of the hooded figure at the trial haunted me. We're only allowed to hunt them at certain times. Those words sank deep into my soul, and every time I remembered them, I felt a tight knot of fear. I realized that I had been a near victim of something far larger, something ancient, lurking just beyond the edges of our world, and that fear never left me.